Hello, art historians. Today we're going to talk about some basic introductory information for ancient Greece. This isn't really a lot of work on actual images as much as it is sort of background information that's necessary to understand the images. So when we look at ancient Greece, we begin to understand that there are particulars in their art and their architecture that then continues to influence art and architecture for centuries. And so when we think about Greece, we know that Greece is broken down into basically three separate time periods. The archaic, which is really old, the classical, which is incredibly important, and archaic means old or ancient, not in use anymore. Then we get into the classical, which starts in 480, and then we get into the final Hellenistic, which is in 323. And what's really interesting or really important when we think about Greece is that we realize that each of these time periods has its own separate sort of set of iconography that goes with it, and that helps to identify these various time periods. So let's look at some background information. When we're looking at Greek temples or Greek buildings, we have what are called the Greek orders. This is called a Doric order. And a Doric order is basically a temple that has sort of a lot of these really straight lines, these little square pieces at the top. This is called dental molding, and the way you can remember it is it looks like teeth, so dental. And a Doric column, I try to remind people, Doric is dull. Doric columns are really boring. They're very simple at the top. They don't have a very complex capital. They come straight down and they attach to the floor or the stylobate without any kind of real big production. That's the most simple one, and that's the earliest one. Then we move into the Ionic order, where we have more decorations, and we'll talk about this more in depth in a little bit, but we have more scalloping, more frillies and all kinds of fun things. And if you'll look, Ionic, this top of the Ionic column kind of looks like the top of the capital I. Okay. Ionic columns come down here and they have a base where the base attaches to the floor. And again, we'll talk about that in a second. And then the third set is Corinthian. And I try to remind people they're crazy Corinthian columns. They have all these crazy flowers at the top, and they have the little swirlies and the dental molding and the fluting on the column and all that stuff. And we'll talk about all those terms. But those are the first three vocabulary words we really want. Six. Archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. We need to know those terms. Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. We need to know those terms. And when we think about these pieces of, these pieces of columns and temples and things that are taken apart and put together for us, we really have to think about sort of the language and the way that they are all put together. And there's actually a whole school of thought about what these all look like and why they look the way that they do. And how to describe all of that. And I think when we were talking about the Temple of Minerva, I even talked about the fact that the construction of Greek temples is just very different than the construction of the Etruscan temples. And I said, wait until we get there and I'll tell you all about the Greek orders. And that's where we are now. We're here talking about Greek orders and what exactly that means and how we define them or explain them. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to look at this, which is an illustration of the three different kinds of these temples and the columns that go with them. So these are called your orders: the Doric order, the Ionic order, and the Corinthian order. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on with all of these things. But the first thing we look at is we look at that dull or boring Doric column. And we notice that there are these cute little things that have the three little bumps, 1, 2, 3. And then we have a flat spot. And then 1, 2, 3, and a flat spot. And sometimes in that flat spot, there's sculptures, but we'll talk about that. And we see the edge of the temple comes down here, and we have this little loopy part and a flat spot. And then we have this whole area here that's just sort of plain because Doric orders are dull. Okay, so we have the triglyphs and the metopes. Then we have this thing called the architrave. And this is the body of the column is called the drum. And then we have the style abate, which is where the drum meets the stairs. Okay, so those are the most important ones. Style abate, drum, architrave, triglyph, metope. Okay, that's the boring Doric, dull Doric. Okay, then we get into the Ionic order, and the Ionic order has a little bit more of a style to it. Okay, we have the corner comes down, but you're going to notice that the corner comes down with a little whoop-dee right there, as opposed to this one that comes down very, severely. Okay, so this is your cornice. This area in the middle here is called your gable, and that whole triangular area is called the pediment. And we will talk about that when we do the Parthenon, because there's so much cool stuff on the Parthenon. Okay, we have this stuff here. We'll talk about frieze, which is a collection of sculptures, and we'll talk about what a frieze is and what it does. Okay, here you see the architrave here is completely flat in a Doric order, but the architrave over here in the Ionic oftentimes has layers to it, like an ogre or an onion. Hopefully you've seen Shrek and you get that joke. Okay, the abacus is really the place where the column meets the architrave. Okay, so that's what you have here, that little line right there. And then this is our capital that looks like an I. This is the column, right? The base of the column, that thing between the column itself and where it sits on the floor. This is the capital. And then those little ins and outs around the base of around the shaft of the column here, those are called flutes and fillets. And so in and out. Okay. So that's Ionic, looks like a letter, like the capital, the top looks like the capital letter I. And then we get into, the Corinthian. And, oh, I'm so sorry. Watch out for that. Then we get into the Corinthian column, all these crazy flowers. You're not going to need to know all of those terms, but that's how we remember that it's a crazy Corinthian column. We call these little things that go down and up and down and up and down and up. We call that dental molding, looks like teeth. Okay, and there we go. We have another column with flutes and fillets. Okay, Corinthian order. This is our base. Notice that the Doric doesn't have a base. And so this is a little more, some people like this drawing better than the other drawing, but it shows you the things that are the same between the temples as well. So cornice, here's your cornice on the Doric, your cornice on the Ionic, your cornice on the Corinthian, often flat Corinthian buildings. Okay, the frieze is this area that's right here that has the sculptures on it. Okay. The architrave is that bit underneath the sculptures that's usually a little bit flat or a little bit thin, right? A little bit lined right above the capital of the column. Capital is that top boring part in Doric, or the eye, or the flowers. Okay. Then we have the column, which is the whole, like that thing, the whole thing that comes down. Okay. Then we have the entablature. And the entablature is basically this whole section. It's a name for this whole section from this line where it meets the roof all the way down here to where it meets the column. It's just called the entablature. And it's like a tablet, like think about it that way. It's all the stuff where the pictures are, where you draw all the pictures, okay? And then we talked about stylobate and stereobate where they attach, okay? And that's only in Doric. Only in Ionic and Corinthians do we have bases, because it just comes straight down to the floor in Doric. So there's that number 8. We have 7 here and 8 here. Everything else has been pretty much shared up until now. Okay. And then we get into 9, the top of the Doric piece, 9 and 10. And then 11 and 12 are those triglyphs and metopes. Okay. Then we get into the Ionic. 13 has this little loopy thing. The little I is called a volute. And this, when it's all one statue, all one picture, it's called a frieze. So when it's broken into these triglyphs and metopes, the triglyphs are the little loopy things, and the metope is a little picture between the loopy things. A frieze is when it is one long picture. We will talk about this much more in depth as we do certain buildings that have these, but it's nice to kind of look at them and see the words and stuff like that before we get started. There's also a concept of the golden mean. which is basically the concept of the ideal of beauty in numbers and proportion and math. And so what I'm going to do for a second is I'm going to escape from here. I'm going to go over to this video, and I'm going to show you a quick 3-minute video on what the golden mean is. It's sort of like the mathematical ratio and equation that runs a lot of Greek art and architecture. It's kind of cool, even for people like me that don't really like math. I think this is really interesting. So watch this, and then I'll be back with you in a second.
The worlds of architecture, design, and art may seem like open, creative endeavors, but they may not be quite as spontaneous as they first appear. When we look at great moments like these, there are similarities that we just can't ignore. All these instances adhere to the same compositional proportions. These proportions are known as the golden ratio. So what is the golden ratio? The golden ratio is a mathematical figure. It was first theorized by ancient mathematicians to quantify the beautiful asymmetry found in nature. Specifically, the golden ratio is equal to roughly 1.618. When the ratio is applied to shapes, like this square, you get a rectangle of harmonious proportions. When the original square is placed over the rectangle, you get a diagram that is representative of the golden ratio. Renaissance artists used the golden ratio extensively in their paintings and sculptures to achieve a sense of balance and beauty. Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, used it to define all the fundamental proportions of his painting of the Last Supper. However, these days it's debated whether the golden ratio is a true universal law. Over the years, Stanford math professor Keith Devlin has run an experiment. He's shown students different rectangles and asked them to pick a favorite. His finding? Students seemingly prefer rectangles at random, which could suggest that the golden ratio is not the subconscious standard of beauty that Greek philosophers believed. That said, ultimate truth may not matter. For artists and designers, the golden ratio can still be a powerful tool for creating aesthetically pleasing designs. Take the Twitter logo. Each part of the logo can be defined by circles that align to the golden ratio. Graphic designer George Bakua is known for modern, minimalist logos for clients and brands all over the world. When designing logos, he relies heavily on the golden ratio, and specifically its derivative, the golden spiral.
In my case, I love the shape of the golden spiral. The shape itself feels right, it looks good. I just use it whenever I can.
So, is the golden ratio true, or is it a myth? For designers and artists, it may be just one more tool on the quest for creative perfection.
And I love that video because I think it really does do a great job of explaining to you what the Greeks believed when it came to the golden ratio and what artists to this day still use when it comes to the golden ratio. But then there's always the question about whether or not it's actually a thing. So when we're looking at it, it looks like this. Fibonacci sequence, nautilus shell, some common things. And the question is, if we lay it over top of the Mona Lisa, we can see that the top of her head fits perfectly in line with the edge of her arm here, and that she becomes part of the golden ratio. It applies to the math on ancient temples, and it applies to the human face as well. That when you divide the face, you know, that there are mathematical distances between the brow and the eyes, the nose and the lips, and how big the distance is. That this distance here, 1.618 and 1, the distance between the eye and the bottom of the chin, 1.618 and 1, the distance from the brow to the bottom. So it's just this idea that math does play a little bit of a part in the way we look at the human face, the human body, and even structures like temples. Okay. We talk about proportion and how things are out of proportion. Proportion is not usually noticed unless something's out of proportion. And when the relative size of the two elements being compared seem wrong or out of balance, we say that it's out of proportion. Think about, the Venus of Willendorf. Some of her body parts were out of proportion. And for example, if a person has a head that's bigger than their body, that would be out of proportion. If a person has a little teeny tiny head and a big body, that would seem like it was out of proportion. And what we see when we talk about proportion is that we like things to be in harmony, but not necessarily equal. So when we look at this, when we divide something equally, it has a tendency to be very boring to the eye. And so we actually find that we prefer things that are proportional, not exact, where the proportions seem to match up. But we have to be careful that we don't go too far out of so equal is a little boring, a little bit disproportionate is good, too much out of proportion creates a lack of harmony. So boring, interesting, confusing is usually how people see things that are not in proportion. That's it for the introduction to sort of the rules and ideas of ancient Greece. The Greek orders, the golden mean, also called the golden ratio or the golden spiral, and the 3 time periods. So that's just an introduction to Greece. And in our next video, we will actually begin studying the images that are in the College Board for Greece. See you next time.